Hey everyone, this is a piece titled Introduction to the Life and Thought of Karl Wittfogel by someone named Richard Peet. Wikipedia says that Richard Peet is a retired professor of human geography at the Graduate School of Geography at Clark University in Worcester, Mass., USA. Peet received a BSc of Economics from the London School of Economics, an MA from the University of British Columbia, and moved to the USA in the mid-1960s to complete a PhD in geography at the University of California, Berkeley. He began teaching at Clark University shortly after completing his PhD from Berkeley, remaining there for over 50 years with secondments in Australia, Sweden, and New Zealand. It says, Peet's areas of interest include social and economic geography, the geography of power, political ecology, liberation ecology, development theory, geography of consciousness and rationality, philosophy and social theory, and critical policy studies. Peet's doctoral research applied von Thunen's theories to the global expansion of commercial agriculture. However, much of Peet's later work was inspired by living in the racially and socially charged situation in America during the 1960s. Peet's early books and articles helped define the field of radical and critical geography. Peet has written extensively on a variety of topics, along with authors such as David Harvey. Peet was part of a movement of radical geographers that have drawn on Marxist theory and techniques. Peet uses the techniques of political economy, looking for interconnections and processes at a variety of scales and over time. Peet believed that geography must do more than simply provide explanations and descriptions of problems studied, but rather attempt to propose alternatives. Peet's political economy focus received critique from feminist and post-capitalist thinkers. During the 1980s and 1990s, Peet's focus shifted to the politics and ecology of international development, particularly the systematic underdevelopment of nations peripheral to the capitalist West. Peet is more critical of neoliberal development theory and global governance institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. He was a supporter of the Socialist Revolution in Grenada, working there prior to the U.S. invasion in 1983. Richard Peet founded the radical journal of geography Antipod at Clark University in 1970 with Ben Wisner and other radical graduate students. It is now one of the top 10 journals in the Anglophone world of geography, but until 1978 it was housed in a basement room in the Graduate School of Geography, and until the late 1970s, mimeographed from typewritten pages stapled by hand and distributed by mail to subscribers. Peet was an editor until 1985 when the journal was sold to Blackwell, which became Wiley. He co-edited Economic Geography from 1992 to 1998. In 2008, Peet founded a new independent journal, Human Geography, a new radical journal, free of the influence of large publishing houses. It was sold to Sage Publishers against the ethos of the journal when he stood down. He was last working on a book on global finance. Capital. His books include Global Political Ecology 2010, India's New Economic Policy, it's an edited volume, from 2010, Unholy Trinity, the IMF, World Bank, and WTO, rewritten and updated, 2009, Theories of Development, Arguments, Contentions, Alternatives, with Elaine Hartwick, 2009, Geography of Power, the Making of Global Economic Policy, 2007, Unholy Trinity, I guess it's a previous print, Theories of Development with Elaine Hartwick, Modern Geographical Thought, 1998, Liberation Ecologies, Environment Development, Social Movements, Global Capitalism, Theories of Societal Development from 1991, New Models in Geography, The Political Economy Approach from 1989, An Introduction to Marxist Theories of Underdevelopment, Papers from the Workshop on Marxist Theories of Underdevelopment, edited by the Department of Human Geography. That's from 1979. International Capitalism and Industrial Restructuring, A Critical Analysis, 1987. Radical Geography, Alternative Viewpoints on Contemporary Social Issues. So, That's Richard Peet. Thanks for listening to me go through these, but, sometimes I read and I feel like I'm missing out because I'm not looking up the details. Karl August Wittfogel, this is his Wikipedia, was a German-American playwright, historian, and sinologist. He was originally a Marxist and an active member of the Communist Party of Germany, but after the Second World War, he was an equally fierce anti-communist. I'm not going to read through his biography. I'm going to go to his politics, and then the section on Oriental despotism. Before the First World War, Wittfogel was the leader of the Lüneburg Wandervogel group. In 1918, he set up the Lüneburg Local. Many years later, Wittfogel was to publish an account of these youth movements under the pseudonym Jungmann in Max Horkheimer's compilation of Studies in Authority and the Family. Wittfogel played a leading role in the Socialist Student Party after the German Revolution. Wittfogel worked alongside Hans Reichenbach and ran an introductory course on what is socialism. Wittfogel joined the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany. At the Meissen Tag, 1923, a large youth movement gathering, Wittfogel asked the members of the Freie Deutsche Jugend whether they knew the need of the age, its big idea, and whether they had what it takes to die for their convictions. After expelling the Communist Workers' Party of Germany, KAPD, in the autumn of 1919, the KPD was significantly reduced in numbers until a majority of Independent Social Democratic Party delegates decided to join it at their party convention in October 1920. Wittfogel was amongst the third of the USPD members, about 300,000, who joined among the 70,000-strong KP. Wittfogel met Karl Korsch in 1920 and was active in the 1923 conference that helped establish the Institute for Social Research. Felix Weil financed, and Richard Zorga organized the Erste Marxistische Arbeitswoche, the first Marxist work week, with Karl Korsch and Hedda Korsch, Georg Lukács, Bela Fogarazzi, his later wife Margaret Lesueur, Felix Jose Weil, and Ketta Weil. They were married 1921 to 1929. Richard and Christina Zorga, Friedrich Pollock, Julian Gumpertz, and his later wife Hedda Mossing. From 1919 to 1923, married to Gerhard Eisler, Konstantin Zetkin, Fukumoto Kazuo, Edward Ludwig Alexander, and Gertrude Alexander, their child, and others. Rosa Wittfogel, born Schlesinger, also took part. They were married from 1921. Other sources say 1920 to 1929. Rosa Wittfogel was a sculptor, later a librarian at the Frankfurt Institute. Rosa Wittfogel emigrated to the Soviet Union and worked there, among other things, as a translator at the Vagar, an organization for foreign workers, and from 1925 to 1933 he was a member of the Institute. This isn't a particularly well put or particularly finished looking Wikipedia entry. Wittfogel received his PhD from the Frankfurter Universität in 1928, where Wittfogel's supervisors were Wilhelm Gerloff, Richard Wilhelm, Franz Oppenheimer. His thesis was on the economical importance of the agrarian and industrial productive forces in China, which became the first chapter of Wirtschaft und Gesellschaft Chinas. Wittfogel was an active member of the German Communist Party and a vocal critic of its enemies. In a short 1974 notice to a reprint of his 1929 essay on political geography, Wittfogel says he came out much stronger against the Nazis than the KPD and the Comintern line wanted. Communist students at Jena invited him and Alfred Baumler for a debate on the importance of Hegel for the Germany of today. Baumler was a specialist on Kant, Nietzsche, and Bachhofen, who soon became a leading Nazi philosopher. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Wittfogel tried to escape to Switzerland but was arrested and interned in prison in concentration camps. Wittfogel's second wife, Olga Joffa Lang, worked for his release and, with the help of right-wing revolutionary Friedrich Hilscher, the also radical right-wing geographer Karl Haushofer, and the London School of Economics historian R.H. Towney managed to get Wittfogel free in 1934. Karl Wittfogel left Germany for England and then the United States. Wittfogel's belief in the Soviet Union was destroyed with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and he began to hate the totalitarian, quote, Asiatic nature, end quote, of the Soviet and Chinese communism, from Lenin to Mao. He turned against his former comrades and denounced American scholars such as Owen Lattimore and Moses I. Finley and the McCarran Committee hearings in 1951. Wittfogel came to believe that the state-owned economies of the Soviet bloc inevitably led to despotic governments even more oppressive than those of, quote, traditional Asia, end quote, and that those regimes were the greatest threat to the future of all mankind. Now I'm going to read about the Oriental Despotism. Oriental Despotism, a comparative study of total power, is a book of political theory and comparative history by Karl August Wittfogel, who lived from 1896 to 1988, published by Yale University Press in 1957. The book offers an explanation for the despotic governments in, quote, Oriental, end quote, societies where control of water was necessary for irrigation and flood control. Managing these projects required large-scale bureaucracies which dominated the economy, society, and religious life. This despotism differed from the Western experience where power was distributed among contending groups. The book argues that this form of, quote, hydraulic despotism, end quote, characterized ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, Hellenistic Greece and Imperial Rome, the Abbasid Caliphate, Imperial China, the Mughal Empire, and Incan Peru. Wittfogel further argues that 20th century Marxist-Leninist regimes, such as the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, though they were not themselves hydraulic societies, did not break away from their historical condition and remained systems of, quote, total power and, quote, total terror, end quote. The book was both welcomed as a historically grounded analysis of despotism that warned the West against the expansion of communist totalitarianism and criticized as a Cold War polemic. The materialist and ecological theories in Oriental despotism influenced ecological anthropologists and global economic historians, even though some of them found fault with its methodology and empirical basis or questioned Wittfogel's political motives. Background. Wittfogel, who was educated in German centers of sinology and joined the German Communist Party in 1920, was dissatisfied with the debate on the Asiatic mode of production that traced back to Montesquieu and Hegel. During the 1920s and 1930s, Wittfogel debated with orthodox Marxist-Leninists who followed Joseph Stalin's dictum that all societies evolve through the same stages of historical growth, which Asia must therefore follow. When Wittfogel was freed from Nazi prison in Germany, Wittfogel came to the United States with his wife in 1933 and made several trips to China for research. Wittfogel's interest in China and immersion in Marxist analysis led Wittfogel to conclusions on the theory of Oriental despotism that differed from the Marxist tradition. Marx held that the historical development outside Europe did not follow the pattern he saw in Europe. Europe, he wrote, developed through a process of class conflict that was from an ancient slave society to feudalism, then bourgeois capitalism, from there to socialism and eventually communism. Modern Europe, in Marx's classical formulation, was created by the conflict between the emerging bourgeois and industrial capitalist classes on the one hand, and the ancien regime as a feudal economy on the other. Wittfogel suggested Asia was immobile because rulers controlled society, but there was no slaves, as in Marxist slave society, nor serfs, as in feudal society. There were no classes, no class conflict, and thus no change. This proposition did not explain how rulers gained their absolute power and why no forces in society opposed them. Wittfogel asked whether there was an explanation found only in these societies. Marxists in both the Soviet Union and in Western countries explored these questions as important in themselves. With special heat, because both liberals and conservatives in the West wanted to decide whether Stalin's Russia was an authentic communist system in Marxist sense or whether it was itself an example of Oriental despotism. One historian of the concept remarks that for Wittfogel, quote, the analysis of Asia was actually intended as a discussion of political relationships within the, quote, West, end quote, end quote. I don't know who said that. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Orthodox theorists in Moscow spurned Wittfogel's views because they differed from Stalin's, and Chinese Marxists rejected them because they implied that China did not have the capability to develop. On a trip to Moscow, however, Wittfogel met the young Chinese scholar Ji Chaoding, an underground communist who became his intellectual disciple. Ji came to the United States for graduate work at Columbia University. Ji's doctoral dissertation, published in 1936 as The Role of Irrigation in Chinese History, argued that a dynasty's success depended on control of irrigation, which increased agricultural production and especially water transportation, which gave the government both military and financial control. Wittfogel also had a productive intellectual relation in the 1930s with Owen Lattimore, whom he met in China. Lattimore, who shared Wittfogel's interest in ecological structures and material conditions, argued that the history of Inner Asia was dominated by the interaction between settled agricultural societies that flourished in the relatively well-watered Rim and the pastoral societies that survived in arid Central Asia. Beginning in the 1930s, Wittfogel pursued research projects that formed a background and preparation for Oriental despotism and published articles presenting aspects of its argument. He finished a manuscript in 1954, but for several years publishers turned it down. Perhaps the topic did not seem attractive, or perhaps the political atmosphere seemed hostile to a book with a Marxist argument, even if that argument was strongly critical of the Soviet Union and the communist government in China. Wittfogel may have had to supply a publication subsidy to Yale University Press. The book has 10 chapters. Chapter 1 is titled The Natural Setting of Hydraulic Society, it explains the geographical settings of hydraulic empires, including ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, Hellenistic Greece, and Imperial Rome, Imperial China, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Mughal Empire, Incan Peru, and 20th century Marxist-Leninist regimes. He preferred the term, quote, hydraulic rather than, quote, oriental, but uses the terms interchangeably. Chapter 2, Hydraulic Economy, a managerial and genuinely political economy. Chapter 3, A State Stronger Than Society. Chapter 4, Despotic Power, Total and Not Benevolent. The absence of effect, which is about the absence of effective constitutional and societal checks and, quote, beggars democracy. Chapter 5, Total Terror, Total Submission, Total Loneliness, argues that, quote, hydraulic government, end quote, is despotic by its very nature. This was a form of, quote, total power because there was no social, legal, or cultural restraints. Wittfogel also denies that in the case of Imperial China there were, quote, rights of rebellion, end quote, such as other Chinese and foreign scholars have seen, but he does hold that a, quote, law of diminishing administrative returns, end quote, kept rulers from controlling all aspects of their subjects' lives so that, quote, genuine elements of freedom remained, end quote. This freedom, however, amounted only to a, quote, beggar's democracy. The, quote, rationality coefficient of hydraulic society, end quote, means the society's ability to get things done, operating at 3 levels at which the government must be effective, managing the agrarian economy, quote, managerial, using corvée and taxes, quote, consumptive, and maintaining peace and order, quote, judicial. Chapter 6 is titled The Core, the Margin, and the Submargin of Hydraulic Societies. Chapter 7 is titled Patterns of Proprietary Complexity in Hydraulic Society. Chapter 8 is titled Classes in Hydraulic Society. Chapter 9 is called The Rise and Fall of the Theory of the Asiatic Mode of Production. And Chapter 10, Oriental Society in Transition. Alright, well, there's a lot of things that I could read more about this, but I think I've done enough of that, you know. You didn't ask to read This isn't the idea of this isn't to read the Wikipedia article. But it did provide a lot of background, so now I feel like I'm ready to get into it. So here we go. The intellectual and political odyssey of Karl August Wittfogel is as perplexing as it is imposing. During the Weimar Republic, Karl Wittfogel was a prolific Marxist theorist and the German Communist Party's leading authority on China. Transplanted in the United States after Hitler's rise to power, Karl Wittfogel eventually became a, quote, renegade of Marxism, end quote, and an ardent opponent of communism. Karl Wittfogel's life and his works are one. Karl Wittfogel's admirers and critics many. Any introduction to Wittfogel cannot be separated from the controversies that surround him. The geographical dimension of his work unfolded within the particular intellectual and political context and controversies of his time. Footnote. Most of this special issue of Antipod is devoted to translation of Wittfogel's seminal article Geopolitik, Geographischer Materialismus und Marxismus, from Unter dem Banner des Marxismus, 1929, an early translation made by Martin Kuppel and Helga Leon, and the final translation by G.L. Ullman. This introduction is mainly intended as a summary of Wittfogel's ideas, with emphasis on the environmental and spatial aspects. A brief assessment is made of the conclusion, and an appendix added on the crucial category of the Asiatic mode of production. So, end footnote. New section. The Notorious Communist. Karl August Wittfogel, born 1896, was the son of a Hanoverian schoolteacher with interest in history and geography. As a young man, Wittfogel joined the Wandervogel, part of a romantic movement among doomed generations of German youth. The Wandervogel, Wikipedia says, the Wandervogel is the name adopted by a popular movement of German youth groups from 1836 to 1933 who protested against industrialization by going to hike in the country and commune with nature in the woods. Drawing influence from medieval wandering scholars, their ethos was to revive old Teutonic values with a strong emphasis on German nationalism. According to historians, a major contribution to the Wandervogel was the revival of folk songs in wider German society. The Wandervogel was divided into three main national groups: the Alt-Wandervogel, the Wandervogel Eingetragener Verein, and the Jung Wandervogel. While the two first ones were generally respectful of tradition, family, the military, the school, the Jung Wandervogel was more defiant and closer to revolutionary ideas. Contrary to scouting organizations, Wandervogel had spontaneously emerged outside of authority controls and recruited their members through selection and co-option. Wandervogel was the dominant trend in the German youth movement between 1901 and 1913. From 1910 members in from 100 members in 1901, they numbered 25,000 to 40,000 adherents in 1914. At its height, the movement had 60,000 to 80,000 members, with 45,000 in the WVEV alone. The name, referring to a magical, free, and weightless bird, can be translated either as a, quote, bird of passage or as a, quote, wandering bird, end quote, slightly different in meaning from the Zugvogel, migratory bird. So, back to the text. As a young man, Wittfogel joined the Wandervogel, part of a romantic movement among a doomed generation of German youth, which heightened his interest in nature. A reading of Nietzsche challenged his naive religious and political ideas. At Leipzig, Wittfogel read Marx as part of a course in history given by Karl Lamprecht in Munich. In Munich, Wittfogel studied aesthetics at Berlin University. Wikipedia says Karl Lamprecht, who lived from 1856 to 1915, was a German historian who specialized in German art and economic history. End footnote. So, at Leipzig University, in Munich, Wittfogel studied aesthetics, and at Berlin University, Hegel, and at Rostock, geography and geology. deepening his interest by studying under Wilhelm Penck during the First World War. As a student and soldier, Wittfogel became a political activist, joining the Independent Social Democratic Party in 1918 and following a party split, the German Communist Party, in 1920, where Wittfogel became the party's leading authority on China. Wittfogel taught with Karl Korsch at a proletarian Volkshochschule in Thuringia. That translates as a folk high school. In 1925, Wittfogel became a member of the newly formed Frankfurt Institute for Social Research. In the late 1920s, Wittfogel was active in a number of international congresses of the Communist League Against Imperialism. The League Against Imperialism, or this is what Wikipedia says, the League Against Imperialism was a transnational anti-imperialist organization in the interwar period. The League Against Imperialism and Colonial Oppression has been referred to as in many texts as World Anti-Imperialist League, or simply and confusingly under the misnomer Anti-Imperialist League. It was established in Egmont Palace in Brussels, Belgium on the 10th of February 1927 in the presence of 175 delegates from around the world. It was significant because it brought together representatives and organizations from the communist world and anti-colonial organizations and activists from the colonized world. 107 out of 175 delegates came from 37 countries under colonial rule. The Congress aimed at creating a, quote, mass anti-imperialist movement, end quote, at a world scale. The organization was founded with the support of the Comintern. Since 1924, the Comintern advocated support of colonial and semi-colonial countries and tried with difficulties to find convergences with the left wing of the Labor and Socialist International and with bourgeois anti-colonial nationalist parties from the colonized world. Another stimulus to create a cross-political cooperation was the revolutionary surge in China since 1923, in which the nationalist Kuomintang was in a united front with the Chinese Communist Party. According to Indian Marxist Vijay Prashad, the inclusion of the word, quote, League, end quote, in the organization's name was a direct attack on the League of Nations, which perpetuated colonialism through the mandate system. At the 1955 Bandung Conference, Sukarno credited the League as the start of an eventually successful worldwide movement against colonialism. So, end footnote. Or that's back to the text. But in 1931, his analysis of the Asiatic mode of production was criticized at the Lenin discussion on the Asiatic mode of production, where the mode was denounced by some participants as a politically harmful perversion of Marxism. According to Wikipedia, the Asiatic mode of production was devised by Karl Marx around the early 1850s. The essence of the theory has been described as, quote, the suggestion, that Asiatic societies were held in thrall by a despotic ruling clique, residing in central cities and directly expropriating surplus from largely autarkic and generally undifferentiated village communities, end quote. I don't know who the quote's from. In his articles on India written between 1852 and 1858, Marx outlined some of the basic characteristics of the Asiatic mode of production that prevailed in India. In these articles, he indicated the absence of private ownership of land, self-sustaining units or communes, the unity between agriculture and manufacturing, hand-loom, spinning wheel, the absence of strong commodity production and exchange, and the stabilizing role of Indian society in culture against invasions, conquests, and famines. The theory continues to arouse heated discussion among contemporary Marxists and non-Marxists alike. Some have rejected the whole concept on the grounds that the socioeconomic formations of pre-capitalist Asia did not differ enough from those of feudal Europe to warrant special designation. Aside from Marx, Friedrich Engels also focused on the Asiatic mode of production. In their later work, both Marx and Engels dropped the idea of a distinct Asiatic mode of production and mainly kept four basic forms: tribal, ancient, feudal, and capitalist. In the 1920s, Soviet authors strongly debated about the use of the term. Some completely rejected it. Others, Soviet experts on China, referred to it as Asiatchiki, suggesting that Chinese land ownership structures had once resembled the Asiatic mode of production, but they were accused of Trotskyism, and discussion of the Asiatic mode of production was effectively banned in the USSR from 1931 until the Khrushchev period. So, back to the text. In turn, Wittfogel became increasingly critical of the Soviet Union, even while taking a prominent role in the German communist reaction to the rise of National Socialism. His analysis of the German Führer as a historical response to a search for a leader by the petite bourgeoisie, which intersected with Hitler's own personal history of bitter experiences, led to his detention as a, quote, notorious communist, end quote, for 8 months in 1933. Wittfogel used the occasion of his release, obtained in part by interventions by the international leftist fraternity, to quickly follow his contemporaries Lukács, Korsch, and Brecht in flight. In 1934, Wittfogel joined the now International Institute of Social Research, IISR, in New York and began an association with the Institute of Pacific Relations. The Institute of Pacific Relations was an international NGO established in 1925 to provide a forum for discussion of problems and relations between nations of the Pacific Rim. The International Secretariat, the center of most IPR activity over the years, consisted of professional staff members who recommended policy to the Pacific Council and administered the international program. The various national councils are responsible for national, regional, and local programming. Most participants were members of the business and academic communities in their respective countries. Funding came largely from businessmen and philanthropies such as the Rockefeller Foundation. IPR International headquarters were in Honolulu until the early 1930s, when they were moved to New York and the American Council emerged as the dominant national council. The IPR was founded in the spirit of Wilsonianism as an awareness of the United States' new role as world power after World War I, and a belief that liberal democracy should be promoted throughout the world. To promote greater knowledge of the issue, the IPR supported conferences, research projects, and publications, and after 1932 published a quarterly journal, Pacific Affairs. After World War II, the charges that the IPR was infiltrated with communists led to the congressional hearings and loss of tax-exempt status. The investigation of the IPR was the first major investigation initiated by the subcommittee. Many IPR members had left liberal orientations typical of internationalists of the 1930s. Some 10 IPR associates were shown to have been communists. Others were sympathetic to the Soviet Union, and the anti-imperialist tone of the leadership aroused resentment from some of the colonial powers. But the more dramatic charges, such as that the IPR was responsible for the fall of China, have not been generally accepted. Back to the text. Wittfogel's critical stance on the Soviet Union was heightened by the Soviet trials and assassinations of the period of 1935 to 37. On his return from fieldwork in China, where he met Owen Lattimore, Wittfogel argued that the Institute for Social Research, International Institute for Social Research, at an International Institute for Social Research seminar, that the masses no longer controlled the centers of Soviet power and that a second revolution was necessary. However, while Wittfogel's, quote, theory of Oriental society, end quote, had matured by this time, he did not yet apply the theory of Oriental society to Russia, nor use the theory of Oriental society to criticize the Soviet Union. Finally, the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939 caused Wittfogel to sever his remaining ties with the Communist Party. Wittfogel also became a critic of Marx and Marxism. Theoretical and empirical work. 1920s to the 1930s. In the early 1920s, Wittfogel wrote on methodological issues and was interested in aesthetics and criticism. However, Wittfogel soon took up the theme of the natural factor in the process of production, basing himself on Marx's conception in Capital Volume 1 as labor as the active process mediating between humans and nature. For Wittfogel, the naturally conditioned powers of production were as important, sometimes more important than those socially conditioned. The relation between humans and nature was the key to historical materialism and to the modes of production. In 1926, with his Awakening China, the concept of an Asiatic mode of production, see appendix for an introduction to this category, founded on the natural conditions peculiar to China, was spelled out in detail. Footnote. Oh, shit. Come on, man. 1 second. Sorry. No footnote. The fundamental characteristics of this mode of production were irrigation and a powerful hydraulic bureaucracy. The managers of the irrigation apparatus became a ruling class, controlling the means of production and exploiting the peasantry through a system of state taxation. In more detailed research on Chinese economic history, Wittfogel developed the idea of changes within the Asiatic mode. These changes had natural and social causes, or natural causes socially mediated. When the government was confronted simultaneously by a natural catastrophe and a war with an external enemy, civil war and the collapse of the dynasty became possible. The spatial relations between China and conflicting social orders developed on the inner Asian steppe. The pacifist ethic of the hydraulic state compared with the warrior ethic of the steppe were particularly significant. In the late 1920s, Karl Wittfogel returned to the natural factor in an article for the journal Unter dem Banner des Marxismus. A second long article extending this analysis was later rejected by this journal and published instead in the Archive für Sozialwissenschaft und Sozialpolitik in 1932. Wittfogel approached the exposition of a Marxist analysis via critiques of, quote, geographical materialism, end quote, and, quote, geopolitics, end quote, as expounded by Richthofen, Ratzel, and Kielen, Haushofer, and the British socialist geographer J.F. Horrobin. Sorry, I'm looking some of these people up. Use Richthofen. There's a Heinrich von Richthofen, who lived from 1833 to 1905, better known in English as Baron von Richthofen, was a German traveler, geographer, and scientist. Richthofen is noted for coining the terms Seidenstrasse and Seidenstrassen, equal to Silk Roads or Silk Routes, in 1877. Richthofen also standardized practices of chorography and chorology. Richthofen was an uncle of the World War I flying ace Manfred von Richthofen. Ratzel. Friedrich Ratzel was a German geographer and ethnographer notable for first using the term Lebensraum, quote, living space, end quote, in the sense that the National Socialists later would. Rudolf Kjellin was a Swedish political scientist, geographer, and politician who first coined the term, quote, geopolitics, end quote. Johann Kjellin, or Rudolf Kjellin's work was influenced by Friedrich Ratzel, along with Alexander von Humboldt, Karl Ritter, and Ratzel. Kjellin would lay the foundations for the German geopolitik, that would later be espoused prominently by General Karl Haushofer. Kjellin completed gymnasium in Skara in 1880 and matriculated at Uppsala University the same year. Rudolf Kjellin completed his PhD in Uppsala in 1891 and was a docent there from 1890 to 1893. Kjellin also taught at Gothenburg University from 1891 and was professor of geopolitical scientists and statistics there from 1901 until he received the prestigious Skyttean Professorship of Eloquence and Government in Uppsala in 1916. A conservative politician, he was a member of the Second Chamber of the Parliament of Sweden from 1905 to 1908 and of its First Chamber from 1911 to 1917. Karl Haushofer was a German general professor, geographer, and diplomat who lived from 1869 to 1946. Haushofer's concept of geopolitik influenced the ideological development of Adolf Hitler. Rudolf Hess was also a student of Haushofer, and during Hess and Hitler's incarceration by the Weimar Republic after the Beer Hall Putsch, Haushofer visited Landsberg prison to teach and mentor both Hess and Hitler. Haushofer also coined the political use of the term Lebensraum, which Hitler used to justify both crimes against peace and genocide. At the same time, however, General Haushofer's half-Jewish wife and their children were categorized as Märchlinge under the Nuremberg laws. Their son, Albrecht Haushofer, was issued a German blood certificate through the influence of Rudolf Hess, but was arrested in 1944 with his involvement with the July 20th plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler and overthrow the Nazi Party. During the last days of the war, Albrecht Haushofer was summarily executed by the SS for his role in the German resistance. After being interrogated by Fr. Edmund A. Walsh, who recommended to Robert H. Jackson that Haushofer be prosecuted at the Nuremberg trials by complicity in Nazi war crimes, Karl and Martha Haushofer died together in a suicide pact outside their home in the American zone of occupied Germany. And the last person that was mentioned was J.F. Horrobin. It says J.F. Horrobin, who lived from 1884 to 1962, was an English socialist and for some time communist radical writer and cartoonist. For years he was Labour Member of Parliament for Peterborough. He attempted to construct a socialist geography and was an associate of David Lowe and George Orwell. Back to the text. Wittfogel traced the origins of Marx's ideas on nature to Herder, Montesquieu, Hegel, and Ritter. While neither the geographical materialists nor the classical economists had been able to solve the question of the role and significance of nature in the historical process of life, by emphasizing material production, Marx achieved a scientific understanding of this process. Wittfogel argued that the role of the natural element in the historical process of life could only be understood via the dialectical materialist method in its societal form as historical materialism, instead of an approach which arbitrarily connects the separate spheres of life, one with another, all with their natural foundation. This conception sees these processes as moments of a historical unity. The Marxist position does not even recognize a contrast between humans and nature. Rather, the human is part of nature. Human labor transforms natural substances into forms adapted to people's needs. The need to transform nature in this way is an eternal condition of human existence. Time and again, Wittfogel said, Marx directs us to the relationship between humans and earth, the twin sources of all material wealth. The earth provides the general objective conditions of human activity: location, source of food, natural container of primary work objects. For this relation, we can derive the formula of the labor process in the most abstract general way. The basic elements of the labor process, purposeful human activity, and the objects and means of labor change during the course of historical development. The means of labor evolve. The labor process lengthens so much that objects emerge which no longer immediately exhibit natural features. Does this mean that the natural element comes to play an unimportant role? No, Wittfogel answers, it only shifts emphasis so that its fundamental importance is continuously reformulated. This is one of the most significant but misunderstood characteristics of the Marxist conception of history. Wittfogel attempts to show that it has found expression in the whole of the life works of Marx. Wittfogel argues that Marx had believed in the specific characteristics of human races existing in different natural conditions. These characteristics were changed as humans acted on the external world. But even later, as the world became socialized by a single mode of production, the original qualities remain, just as the original fertility remains with soil improved by human labor. When he focused on the labor process, by which humans alter themselves and remake nature, Wittfogel seized on the natural origins of the means of production. As the societal production process matures, the significance of nature also grows. As opposed to Lukács, who emphasized society's domination of nature, Wittfogel agreed with Marx, Engels, Plekhanov, and Lenin in emphasizing the persistence of natural influences on human life. According to Marx, humans and nature are the two ultimate and inevitable factors in the development of societal production in all its historical forms. The natural element does not retreat, let alone vanish, with historical development. Which element ultimately determines historical development, the societal or the natural? People make their own histories, said Marx, but under circumstances not of their own choosing, rather under already existing circumstances. An active materialism emphasizing human activity has also to emphasize the objective conditions under which this activity can be effective. As well as the societal conditions of productive activity, there are natural conditions without which the creation of real wealth is impossible. The objective structure of nature indicates a quite determined course for productive activity to follow. Activity can only be organized in such a way as the accessible natural objects and means of labor allow. Which natural elements are tapped depends on the social productive forces. However, the direction and possibility of change of the labor process depends on the naturally conditioned productive forces usable at a given time. Only by an increasingly profound adaptation to nature does progressive human development occur. Thus, because social organisms found different means of production and subsistence in their natural environments, their modes of production and living were different. From the different naturally conditioned structures of productive forces came differential development of the original primitive communal life. Subsequently, agricultural development depended on the different natural endowments. Thus, the development paths of the eastern and western continents were different. Feudal agriculture remained at a relatively low level, for the only natural machine used was soil fertility. By comparison, a constellation of naturally given elements propelled the higher development of the Asiatic form. Of these, irrigation water, necessitated by climate and soil conditions, formed a second immensely effective natural productive force. In these early societies, the naturally conditioned productive forces were crucial for the direction of development. With the development of large-scale industry, the second kind of natural wealth and means of production, waterfalls, navigable rivers, wood, metal, and coal, decided the matter. The locations of these means explain variations in the development of industrial capitalism. Compare France, where industrial development was stifled by natural factors, with industrialized England. Likewise, England developed more slowly in the recent past, in part because of the depletion of its natural wealth. Only the generation of new productive forces as part of a societal revolution could compensate for geographical disadvantages. Hence, the natural element would remain important in the socialist future. The breakthrough to socialism involved a release of the productive forces in a new organization of production. This implied a fundamentally changed attitude towards nature. Parts of nature unexploitable before could now be used. Already exploited ones could be used in a new way. The realm of freedom had the realm of necessity as its basis. In a concrete regional study, Economy and Society in China, from 1931, let's see. I'm not seeing anything. Wittfogel interpreted Marx as arguing that the relation between man and nature is the core of the science of history. Quote, "The writing of history must always set out from these natural bases, the actual physical nature of man, the natural conditions in which man finds himself, geological, orohydrological, climatic, and so on, and their modification in the course of history through the action of men." End quote. Wittfogel therefore began his regional historical study of the structure of Chinese society with a survey of the natural setting. This formed the physical basis of specific types of primary economic activities and made necessary large-scale cooperation and organization for the development of forces of agricultural production. Irrigation was to Chinese, Asiatic agrarian society what coal and iron production were to English capitalist industry. Yet the function of irrigation was different under unlike ecological conditions, producing a regionally diverse agricultural space. This space was dominated by an economic political core area which shifted from the small river valleys of northwest China to the Great Plain of the northeast to the large river valleys of central and south China. The shifts coincided with transition stages in Chinese history. In each core/stage, hydraulic techniques were transferred and further developed along with the amount of and extent of bureaucratically controlled social cooperation. By the end of the Chao dynasty, I don't know if I'm saying that right, what had been a feudal mode was transformed into a fully fledged Asiatic mode of the kind described by Marx. The Zhou dynasty was a royal dynasty of China that existed for 789 years, from 1046 BC until 256 BC, the longest such reign in Chinese history. During the Western Zhou period of 1046 to 771 BC, the royal house, surnamed Ji, had military control over ancient China, even as Zhou suzerainty became increasingly ceremonial over the following Eastern Zhou period, 1771 to 256 BC. The political system created by the Zhou royal house survived in some form for several additional centuries. A date of 1046 BC for the Zhou's establishment is supported by the Xia Shang Zhou chronology project and David Parkenier, but David Nivison and Edward L. Shaughnessy date the establishment to 1045 BC. The latter, Eastern Jew period, is itself roughly subdivided into two parts. During the spring and autumn period, 771 to 481 BC, power became increasingly decentralized as the authority of the royal house diminished. The Warring States period, 481 to 221 BC, that followed saw large-scale warfare and consolidation among what had formerly been Zhou client states, until the Zhou were formally extinguished by the state of Qin in 256 BC. The Qin ultimately founded the imperial Qin dynasty in 221 BC after conquering all of China. The Zhou period is often considered to be the zenith of the craft of Chinese bronzeware. The later Zhou period is also famous for the advent of three major Chinese philosophies: Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. The Zhou dynasty also spans the period when the predominant form of written Chinese became seal script, which evolved from the earlier oracle bone and bronze scripts. By the dynasty's end, an immature form of clerical script had also emerged. So that's the Zhou dynasty. Back to the text. By the end of the Zhou dynasty, what had been a feudal mode was transmitted into a fully fledged Asiatic mode of the kind described by Marx. In the Asiatic mode of production, in the Asiatic mode, the state participated actively in the process of production. Thus, there is no absolute dichotomy between economic foundation and political superstructure, including industrial development, while also the power of traders was restrained. Footnote. In the sketchy first drafts of his second volume, Wittfogel followed Marx and Engels in tracing the origins of the state to the origin of classes and the class struggle which emerged once the forces of production had attained a certain level of development. This, quote, endogenousness, end quote, root was opposed to, quote, an end quote, exogenous root, a conquest theory of the state. While both might determine the shaping of the emerging state, it was the endogenous root which was most often decisive. End footnote. The existing relations of production, the mode of production as a whole, including its political and legal expressions, moved with identifiable regularity. As long as the Asiatic mode of production, with its powerful state, remained dominant in China, capitalism could not develop. However, China's Asiatic society was no, quote, solid crystal, end quote. Crisis came internally from both the mode of production, Marx, and the bureaucratic power structure, Weber. This internal change was articulated with external influences. In particular, China's Asiatic society decomposed under the impact of Western imperialism. Quote, the remnant of old, quote, Asiatic, end quote, China is like a blockhouse eaten away by termites. The next great storm will cause everything to collapse. Yet numerous forms, however, worm-eaten, decayed, and reduced, still stand up more or less amid the elements of a modern mode of production. End quote. Ullman. There's a footnote that I missed. It says, the original quotation, I don't know what this is in reference to, I'm not going to look back to it, but I'll read it. The original quotation is given to Marx and Engels, the, quote, German ideology in Marx and Engels' collected works. New York International Publishers, 1976, Volume 5, page 31, quote, the first premise of all human history is, of course, the existence of living human individuals. Thus, the first fact to be established is the physical organization of these individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature. Of course, we cannot here go either into the actual physical nature of man, nor into the natural conditions in which man finds himself, geological or hydrographical, climatic, and so on. All historical writing must set out from these natural bases and their modification in the course of history through the action of men. End quote. The subsequent growth of Asiatic capitalism was seen as the synthetic result of certain indigenous movements. The subsequent growth of Asiatic capitalism was seen as the synthetic result of certain indigenous movements directed by the superstructure and, quote, external, end quote, effects from Western capitalism, which had already reached the middle of the late stages of its development as it destroyed ancient Chinese society. The middle 1930s brought research on family authority in China. Family authority structure, Wittfogel argued, reflected the type and allocation of labor. The change from matrilineal to patrilineal family was a consequence of the development of the forces of production. The particular mechanism stressed by Wittfogel was the need for an intensification of male labor, with the use of improved agricultural means of production, such as artificial irrigation works. This also transformed collective means of production, herds and land, into small units which became private property. Class stratification occurred, and the political state reformed. The intensity of Chinese agriculture was conducive to small-scale units of production, and thus the prevalence of small rather than extended families, although these existed within the remains of earlier clan relations. The extraordinary power of the head of the Chinese family had its origin in the production skills residing in old men and the delegation of power by a bureaucratic state controlling agro-hydraulic production tasks. Wittfogel compared this structure with the Western family, which he found more volatile than that of the East. Wittfogel's theory of, quote, Wittfogel's, quote, theory of Oriental society, end quote, closed with this period of obviously Marxist work and pointed the way towards his later work, Oriental Despotism. Published in 1957, Wittfogel outlined a version of a quote, critical theory, end quote, which emphasized the necessity of placing phenomena in their full historical and spatial context. The structural principle of all social formations and conflicts was the antagonistic patterns and movements of, and the concrete forms taken by, the realm of work. Oriental society, he argued, had progressed through a series of forms. The simple early form of Oriental society was the clan, with communally regulated agriculture and the surplus going to support a state which controlled labor. This early form was destroyed by the growth of the forces of production, yielding a developed form characterized by private property, greater class stratification, and the development of merchant capitalism. This more complex social form was prone to crisis, arising from natural events or catastrophes, and from internal conflicts between central and dispersed power holders, and between these and the peasantry. The complex form interacted unevenly with neighboring nomadic societies, which had cycles of development distinct from the dynastic cycle of Oriental society. Inter-crisis mechanisms either directly affected or opened the way for externally imposed changes in a dynasty. Such a process of change was different from Marx's formulation of the crisis mechanism of bourgeois society, in that it was economic, political, rather than purely economic, structural. In Oriental society, moreover, a change took the form of a vicious circle. Quote, the socio-economic system reproduced itself instead of developing itself, end quote. Whereas the decentralized feudal order of the West permitted the growth of new forces of capitalist production, Oriental agriculture required a coordinating force, a hydraulic state, which in turn prevented the growth of commercial and industrial capitalism. Oriental society was self-perpetuating. New section, Changing Politics. In the 1940s, Wittfogel and Wittfogel's wife, anthropologist Esther Goldfrank, began spending their summers with ex-communists at a farm in Pennsylvania. Wikipedia says Esther Schiff Goldfrank, who lived from 1896 to 1997, was an American anthropologist of the famous German-American Schiff family. Esther Goldfrank had studied with Franz Boas and specialized in the Pueblo Indians. Esther Goldfrank worked closely with Elsie Clues Parsons and also with Ruth Benedict on the Blackfoot. Esther Goldfrank published on Pueblo religion, Cochiti sociology, and Isleta drawings. Goldfrank received her bachelor's degree from Barnard College in 1918 and graduated from Columbia University in 1937. Esther Schiff Goldfrank married the historian and sinologist Karl August Wittfogel after the death in 1935 of her first husband, Walter Goldfrank. Back to the text, there's a footnote. In 1947, Wittfogel was appointed professor of Chinese history at the University of Washington, Seattle. Karl Wittfogel continued, however, to direct the Chinese History Project, begun in 1938 under the sponsorship of the International Institute for Social Research and IPR, but now sponsored by Columbia University. End footnote. During the 1940s, he became increasingly active in anti-communist groups like the Union for Democratic Action, the Committee for Cultural Freedom, and the Friends of German Labor. The Union for Democratic Action was an American political organization advocating liberal policies and the preservation and extension of democratic values domestically and overseas. It existed from 1941 to 1947 and was the precursor organization to the group Americans for Democratic Action. Okay. Committee for Cultural Freedom. The Committee for Cultural Freedom was an American political organization active from 1939 to 1951, which advocated opposition to the totalitarianism of both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany in foreign affairs and promoted pro-democratic reforms in public and private institutions. Co-founded by influential philosopher and educator John Dewey and anti-Soviet Marxist academic Sidney Hook, it was organized in January 1951 into the American Committee for Cultural Freedom. And the last one to look up is the Friends of German Labor. Can't find anything for that anyway. Back to the text. In 1949, he wrote a memorandum for a State Department-sponsored conference of Far East specialists. Wittfogel's remarks were dedicated to reversing the advance of communism, suggesting that U.S. public opinion on the Far East had been misled by Stalinist interpretations propagated by American academics and journalists. By this time, he had also broken his long friendship with Owen Lattimore, who in a rival paper for the State Department advocated the immediate recognition of Communist China and U.S. openness to establishing relations with communist countries. In 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy named Lattimore as the, quote, top Russian agent in the United States, end quote, a man who influenced State Department policy making, an accusation subsequently called, quote, a fraud and a hoax, end quote, by the Tidings Committee. The Tidings Committee was the subcommittee on the investigation of loyalty of State Department employees, more commonly referred to as the Tidings Committee, was a subcommittee authorized by Senator S. Ress 231 in September 1950 to look into charges by Joseph R. McCarthy that he had a list of individuals who were known as this by the Secretary of State to be members of the Communist Party of the United States of America, CPUSA, who were still working in the State Department. Back to the text. The issue was investigated by the McCarran Committee. Later in the same year, Wittfogel was subpoenaed to appear for the House Committee on Un-American Activities in executive session and was further subpoenaed as an involuntary witness to appear in open session when the McCarran Committee began its investigation into Owen Lattimore and the Institute of Pacific Relations in 1951. The McCarran Committee, also known as the United States Senate's Special Subcommittee to investigate the administration of the Internal Security Act and other internal security laws, 1951 to 77, known more commonly as the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, and sometimes the McCarran Committee, was authorized by S. 366, approved December 21st, 1951, to study and investigate 1. The administration, operation, and enforcement of the Internal Security Act of 1950, and also known as the McCarran Act, and other laws relating to espionage, sabotage, and the protection of the internal security of the United States. And 2, the extent, nature, and effects of subversive activities in the United States, quote, including but not limited to espionage, sabotage, and infiltration of persons who are or may be under the domination of the foreign government or organization controlling the world communist movement, or any movement seeking to overthrow the government of the United States by force and violence, end quote. The resolution also authorized the subcommittee to subpoena witnesses and require the production of documents. Because of the nature of its investigations, the subcommittee is considered by some to be the Senate equivalent to the older House Un-American Activities Committee. Back to the text. In his testimony, Wittfogel stated that while he had not known him to be a communist, Lattimore's political inclinations had assumed a consistently pro-Soviet pattern, that he had argued in 1944 that the best solution for Korea would be for the Soviet Union to take it over. This was immediately denied by Lattimore. At this time, Wittfogel also began to criticize Marx. While Marx had recognized the Oriental state as a power controlling the decisive means of Oriental production, irrigation works, Marx had avoided designating the state bureaucracy as a ruling class, thus also avoiding, Wittfogel believed, the lessons that could be learned from this historical examination of state ownership. During the early 1950s, Wittfogel became isolated from his previous political and academic associates, such as Karl Korsch, for example. Wittfogel found few students registered for his courses. However, a new constellation of interest in his ideas began to form around Julian H. Stewart, an American anthropologist committed to the multilinear evolution of human societies. Wikipedia says Julian Stewart, who lived from 1902 to 1972, was an American anthropologist known best for his role in developing, quote, the concept and method, end quote, of cultural ecology, as well as a scientific theory of cultural change. Back to the text. Also, cultural geographers came to know his work via his participation in the 1956 symposium on man's role in changing the face of the earth. In 1957, Wittfogel's major work, Oriental Despotism, was published. Theoretical developments. In the early 1940s, Wittfogel's conception of the structure of society moved away from the question of determination by ecological and economic conditions and towards an emphasis on social and political frameworks. During a 1947 reading of the 1906 Plekhanov-Lenin debates, Wittfogel was impressed by Lenin's arguments on Russia's Asiatic past and the possibility of an Asiatic restoration. In the late 1940s, Wittfogel worked on a socio-historical evaluation of Russia, whose institutional development Wittfogel interpreted in terms of the coexistence of Eastern and Western elements. For 250 years, Russia had been a marginal, then sub-marginal part of an Oriental empire, during which time it had incorporated features from the Oriental core and decisively influenced its subsequent victory. Thus, Kievan Russia was, quote, a marginal Western society diverted and modified by Oriental influences, end quote. The Mongol invasion in the 12th century intensified the process of Orientalization. Despotic government and an Oriental pattern of land tenure, which fully developed in post-Mongol Tsarist Russia. Ending in a period of state-directed industrialization using until the late 19th century unfree forced labor. According to Wikipedia, the Mongol invasion of Kievan Rus, it says that the Mongol Empire invaded and conquered much of Kievan Rus in the mid-13th century, sackering numerous cities, including largest cities such as Kiev, 50,000 inhabitants, and Chernigov, 30,000 inhabitants. The Mongol siege and sack of Kiev in 1240 is generally held to mark the end of Kievan Rus as a distinct singular polity. Many other Rus principalities and urban centers in the northwest and southwest escaped destruction or suffered little to no damage from the Mongol invasion, including Galicia, Volhynia, Novgorod, Pskov, Smolensk, Polotsk, Vitebsk, and probably Rostov and Uglik. The campaign was heralded by the Battle of the Kalka River in May 1223, which resulted in a Mongol victory over the forces of several Rus principalities, as well as the remnants of the Cumans under Khitan. The Mongols retreated, having gathered their intelligence, which was the purpose of the reconnaissance in force. A full-scale invasion of Rus by Batu Khan followed. From 1237 to 1241, the invasion was ended by the Mongol succession process upon the death of Ogadai Khan. Even those Rus principalities who avoided physical conquest were eventually forced to accept Mongol supremacy in the form of tribute, as in the case of Galicia, Volhynia, Polotsk, and Novgorod, if not outright vassalage of the Golden Horde, until well into the 14th century. The invasion facilitated the breaking of the Kievan Rus' principalities, having profound ramifications for the history of Eastern Europe, including the division of the East Slavic people into separate polities. So, back to the text. As opposed to the, quote, developmental, end quote, revolutions characteristic of the West, the Orient produced revolutions of a regenerative and cathartic nature. The 1917 Russian Revolution in Russia contained both these developmental and regenerative possibilities. By the late 1920s and the early 1930s, however, the state bureaucracy had achieved a power over the economy unparalleled even in Oriental society, a rise which Wittfogel correlates with the fall from favor of Marx's Asiatic concept among the Soviets and their followers. These themes are most fully developed in Wittfogel's major work, Oriental Despotism. This summarized the end results of several decades of an evolving set of ideas. Wittfogel began with a reformulation of the dialectic between humans and an ever-changing nature. Quote, "Man never stops affecting his natural environment. Man constantly transforms his natural environment, and man actualizes new forces whenever man's efforts carry man to a new level of operation. Whether a new level can be attained at all, or once attained, where that new level will lead, depend first on the institutional order and second on the ultimate target of man's activity, the physical, chemical, and biological world accessible to man. Institutional conditions being equal, it is the difference in the natural setting that suggests and permits or precludes the development of new forms of technology, subsistence, and social control," end quote. Wittfogel, Oriental Despotism, page 11. I don't know if I've said this already in this recording or not, because I'm recording it in chunks, but a lot of the things I say in these things are, what am I saying? I try to follow the pronouns, right, within when I'm reading. So if someone says it or he a lot, or referring to a particular thing, I try to say the proper noun, or proper name, I guess, of it, in order just to follow the thread. Especially when you get into, like, Marx, for instance, like, sometimes following the pronouns becomes very difficult. So I might screw up the pronouns from time to time. I might, but just be cautious of that when you're listening to me. In a footnote, Wittfogel said that this differs from his earlier conception in terms of its emphasis on the primary importance of institutional and cultural factors. From this premise followed, quote, "man's freedom to make a genuine choice in historically open situations," end quote. This position enabled him to criticize certain ideas of Marx which he had previously accepted. Apart from this idea of freedom of movement and cultural evolution, however, he maintained that his perspective of the early 1930s had not fundamentally changed. Footnote. In the late 1960s, at a conference at the University of Washington on agrarian problems in communist countries, Wittfogel returned to this conception of the relation between nature and society. Quote, "My attempt to identify diversities in hydrological conditions as a means of distinguishing patterns of farming suggests that the ecological factor is significant, but a differentiating analysis of its effects warns us against confusing causal and deterministic relations. Causal relations between natural conditions and human responses are general, deterministic relations are not. Contrary to the claims of the geographical determinist, a given natural foundation does not necessarily lead to a single type of human action, ... A given ecological condition is not necessarily compelling. It does not necessarily have only one institutional correlation. In most cases, the natural foundation is either permissive, offering the possibility of several types of human action, or suggestive, favoring one type of human action more than others, but without precluding them. Rarely is it compatible with only one type of human action, ... Thus, the deterministic variant of ecological causality is more the exception than the rule." End quote. Wittfogel. End footnote. At a more detailed level, Wittfogel argued that the agricultural potential of dry but fertile lands could only be actualized when humans had learned to utilize the reproductive processes of plant life. This task imposed by the natural environment stimulated the development of hydraulic methods. While temperature and surface conditions continued to limit human action, water, like vegetation and soil, proved manipulable and manageable as it is automatically follow the law of gravity. Yet water was also bulky. Water's large-scale use was a technical task solved by mass labor or not at all. 1 second. sorry, I just wanted to look something up real quick. I'm going to read it in a second. The venture, involving great effort and fraught with problematic institutional consequences, has been entered by numerous groups of humans, but has not been entered into by others, tribal gatherers, hunters, fishermen, and pastoralists. In other words, the situation was open and the hydro-agricultural course only one of several possible choices. However, the frequency with which the choice was made in diverse areas suggested regularity in human evaluation and procedure. The basis for this regularity of choice Wittfogel specified as follows. Quote, man pursues recognized advantage. Whenever internal or external causes suggest a change in technology, material production, or social relations, he compares the merits of the existing situation with the advantages and disadvantages that may accrue from the contemplated change, ... When the sum total of the accruing benefits clearly and convincingly exceed the required sacrifices, man is willing to make the change, ... bracket, in this decision, end bracket, the material factor weighs heavily, but the material factor's relative importance can be reasonably defined only when full recognition is given to such other values as personal safety, absence of oppression, and time-honored patterns of thought and action, end quote. Wittfogel, Oriental Despotism. Thus, agriculture, which profoundly affected the material conditions of mankind, was not initially or even subsequently adopted by many primitive groups. This showed the attractiveness of non-material values when increased material security could be obtained only at the expense of political, economic, and cultural submission. History thus offered a genuine choice, and humans proceeded not as passive instruments of an irresistible unilinear developmental force, but as discriminating active beings shaping their future. The thing I wanted to look up is, I wanted to see if there was if there was a hydraulic empire entry on Wikipedia, and there is. It says a hydraulic empire, also known as hydraulic despotism, hydraulic society, hydraulic civilization, or water monopoly empire, is a social or government structure which maintains power and control through exclusive control over access to water. It arises through the need for flood control and irrigation, which requires central coordination and a specialized bureaucracy. Often associated with these terms and concepts is the notion of a water dynasty. The body is a political structure which is commonly characterized by a system of hierarchy and control, often based on class or caste. Power both over resources, food, water, energy, and a means of enforcement such as the military is vital for the maintenance of control. So that's that. Back to the text. Hydraulic agriculture, developed in the semi-arid and arid East, involved a specific division of labor with an emphasis on preparatory and protective operations which had to occur on a large scale when large quantities of water had to be manipulated. The key organizational devices were widespread cooperation, planned integration, even complex organizational planning, organizers, disciplinarians, and leaders. Hydraulic agriculture, characterized by heavy waterworks, developed the peculiarities of hydraulic society, as in, for example, the huge spatial scale of the management of operations. Other types of large-scale construction, like aqueducts and reservoirs, navigation canals, defense structures, roads, palaces, tombs, temples, and capital cities, achieved a distinctive monumental style because of centralized control over extensive labor powers. By comparison, the scattered operations of rainfall farming in the West did not involve extensive cooperation, and society took the form of a decentralized feudal system, the only regional and territorial authority being religion. The church combined feudal with, quote, quasi-hydraulic, end quote, patterns of organization and acquisition. In the Oriental system, the state occupied a position of unrivaled operational leadership and organizational control. The labor force of a wide space being coerced by a state which had a monopoly on large preparatory and protective activities. As manager of large constructions, the hydraulic state prevented the crystallization of non-governmental forces into institutional bodies strong enough to counterbalance its power. Thus, the state restricted the development of private property by prescribing disintegrative laws by which property was periodically divided between heirs. Likewise, the dominant religion did not achieve independent authority, but was attached to the hydraulic state by convergence at the center of all mystical power. Footnote. In hydraulic economies, timekeeping and calendar making were essential aspects of state leadership and planning. Quote, wrapped in a cloak of magic and astrology and hedged with profound secrecy, these mathematical and astronomical operations became the means both for improving hydraulic production and bulwarking the superior power of the hydraulic leadership. End quote. Oriental despotism. End footnote. Hence the theocratic nature of the hydraulic state. At this point, immediately after his discussion of the economic managerial function of the state, Wittfogel outlined its central characteristic: despotic power, total and not benevolent. Total power developed in the absence of effective societal or cultural checks and was limited only by the law of diminishing administrative returns to the extension of state authority into all spheres of life. The state kept the agrarian economy going. It could not increase the corvée and taxes beyond the point where peasant production was discouraged. Also, it could not permit strife to disrupt the life of the people. These were the regime's, quote, rationality minimum, end quote. But once the hydraulic economy was established, the state could intensify the state's acquisition operations, guided by the pursuit of the ruler's, quote, managerial optimum, end quote, expressed as a maximal consumption of goods with maximal conspicuousness, quote, splendor, end quote, and the exertion of a maximum of influence on the country's laws. The result was to corrupt absolutely those, quote, who bask in the sun of total power, end quote. Oriental Despotism, page 133. While agro-managerial despots may have presented their regimes as benevolent, even under the most favorable circumstances, they strove for their own, not their people's, rationality optimum, planning their hydraulic enterprises according to, quote, what benefits their might and wealth, end quote. Oriental Despotism, page 136. Because the, quote, urge to act independently is an essential attribute of Homo sapiens, end quote. However, military coercion concentrated in the absolutist rulers had to be exercised to terrorize the subjects. The members of the hydraulic community adjusted their behavior accordingly. Quote, obedience becomes the basis of good citizenship, end quote. The mass individual's condition was thus described as total alienation, utter isolation. Wittfogel regarded this conception of a specifically Oriental society as countering the, quote, fiction of a unilinear and irresistible development, end quote, which he traced to 19th century overgeneralizations from the European experience by Hegel, Fourier, Comte, Spencer, and more importantly, quote, contemporary Marxism-Leninism, which combines ideological and political means to liquidate both the theory of Oriental society and the concept of a multilinear development, end quote. Oriental Despotism, page 369. By comparison, Wittfogel thought, Marx and Engels accepted the Asiatic concept, while Lenin continued to uphold the idea of a special Asiatic system over 3 decades. But Marx mystified the class structure of the Asiatic mode by designating a single person, the ruler, or in abstraction, the state, as the ruling class, even though he is clearly aware that members of the ruler's household and the government functionaries shared in the surplus. Engels, in The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, discussed the origin of the state as though he had never heard of the socio-administrative state or Oriental despotism. Wittfogel ascribed this, quote, sin against science, end quote, to a recognition of the embarrassing similarities between Oriental despotism and the total management and dictatorial socialist state which Marx and Engels wished to establish. Marx and Engels' distortions eventually produced increasingly retrogressive results in the case of Lenin, who avoided crucial realities in traditional Asia, neglected essential state managerial features of the Tsarist regime in Russia, and equivocated in designating Russia's ruling class, most frequently describing it as dominated by noble landowners. In the debates at the 1906 Stockholm Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Party, Plekhanov 1 second. Plekhanov questioned Lenin's plan for the nationalization of land as leaving, quote, untouched the survival of an old semi-Asiatic order, end quote. Plekhanov. Lenin's revolutionary perspective was challenged, Wittfogel claims, by the very Asiatic interpretation of Russian society that had been a Marxist axiom. Immediately after the Congress, Lenin began to minimize Russia's Asiatic heritage, using terms like, quote, medieval, quote, patriarchal, quote, pre-capitalist, and increasingly, quote, feudalism when referring to the Russian past. In Lenin's State and Revolution of 1917, Lenin referred only to the private property-based state, completely neglecting the functional state in general and Russia's Oriental despotism in particular. However, in the 1920s, Lenin again began to refer to the anti-socialist dangers inherent in the new Soviet bureaucracy whose roots lay in the fragmented and dispersed, poverty-stricken character of the small producers. Russian society had not yet emerged from its, quote, semi-Asiatic, end quote, lack of culture. The Soviet state apparatus, Lenin concluded just before his death, was to a large extent the survival of the old with its surface repainted. Wittfogel found a resurgence of Soviet interest in the concept of the Asiatic mode of production in the late 1920s. But then Stalin interpreted China's agrarian order as feudal rather than Asiatic, and discussions held at Leningrad in 1931 rejected as un-Marxist the idea that a functional bureaucracy could be a ruling class, strengthened the feudal interpretation of Oriental history, and claimed the theory of the Asiatic mode imperiled the work of the Communist International in the colonial countries of Asia. Although the conference was inconclusive, it was already clear to the communist leadership that, quote, the concept of a managerial bureaucratic, quote, Asiatic, end quote, state ultimately had to wither away, end quote. Wittfogel, Oriental Despotism, page 405. During the 1930s, Soviet writers tried to establish a feudal explanation for phenomena labeled Asiatic by Marx. Stalin rejected the idea that an unchanging geographical environment could be a, quote, determining cause of social development, end quote. And in his Dialectical and Historical Materialism of 1939, edited Marx's preface to a critique of political economy to exclude the reference to an Asiatic mode. By the end of the Second World War, Marxist-Leninists the world over were ignoring the concept. Thus, Owen Lattimore, who in the 1930s had been impressed by Wittfogel's hydraulic bureaucratic concept, was by the late 1940s characterizing the traditional societies of Asia as feudal. In his concluding chapter, Wittfogel argued that recognition of the peculiarity of hydraulic society is crucial in the formulation of a multilinear pattern of societal evolution in the past and for an understanding of changes occurring in the East in the present. This led him to place hydraulic society within a schema of societal types. Among the features that appear in any given society, some were essential for the society's functioning, some specific to that society, some neither. Thus, agro-managerial despotism was essential and specific to hydraulic society. Non-specific elements compatible with several types of society flowed over space. The Chinese script to Japan demonstrated that there was no necessary relation between all possible aspects of the same social organism. Essential features were few in number and limited in their combinations. Wittfogel found 5 types of society intervening historically between the primitive tribalism and modern industrial society. Pastoral, two types of ancient, feudal, and hydraulic. Diverse patterns of transformation affected by external forces characterized all societies. Hydraulic society was the outstanding case of societal stagnation. Hence, the morphology of societal change was complex. Behind problems of form lay problems of value. 3 often conflicting relations interlocked in any society: the human's relation to nature, human relations to humans, and the human relation to his or her own convictions, secular and religious. A limited number of primary processes transform societies, while secondary changes produce new subtypes or restorations of the original order. Hydraulic society best exemplified restorative development. Transformation, if it occurred, happened only through the direct or indirect effects of the penetration of external forces, but interrelations between the Orient and the West were of different types, while conditions also varied greatly in the hydraulic countries. Hence, present-day developments in the hydraulic world would follow no single pattern. The case of Russia is of particular importance, for it was the first major country in the Oriental world to break with its agro-despotic past and with the West, and after 1917 became the most influential source of anti-Western action in Asia and elsewhere. In 1917, there existed a genuinely open historical situation in which the Soviet leadership, if the Soviet leadership had developed the new freedoms in a truly revolutionary way, might have completed Russia's transformation into a multi-centered democratic society. But they lacked the experience and resolve. Humans act in accordance with their innermost convictions. The way was opened not to an Asiatic restoration, as Lenin believed, for the men of the new apparatus were not satisfied with ruling over a world of peasants and craftsmen. They wanted much more. Quote, "The industrial despotism of the fully developed and totally managerial apparatus society combined total political power with social and intellectual control, ... We can truly say that the October Revolution, whatever its expressed aims, gave birth to an industry-based system of general state slavery," end quote. Oriental Despotism, page 440 to 441. Likewise, China moved quickly to establish a new semi-managerial order. Quote, "Whither Asia?" end quote, Wittfogel asked. Asian socialists were indifferent to Marx's Asiatic ideas and ignored what he had called the, quote, "greatest desideratum of Asian society," end quote, private property and land. Influenced by crypto-communist ideology, it could well be that Asian countries, excepting Japan, would cease resisting the political erosion to which they were exposed, with the consequence of a, quote, "spectacular manifestation of a retrogressive societal development," end quote. Oriental Despotism. Can the West prevent a development which would extend bureaucratic state slavery to two-thirds of mankind? Close contact with the West has produced the opportunity for a multi-centered and democratic society, but this can be realized only by a West whose attitude is informed and bold. Today, that attitude is neither. Quote, "We do not give full scope to the anti-totalitarian forces in the Western world, and failing to do this, we did little to strengthen the anti-totalitarian forces in the hydraulic societies in transition," end quote. Oriental Despotism. This can be changed by a new insight, fully perceived, convincingly communicated, daringly applied. Ultimately, the readiness to sacrifice depends on the proper evaluation of the two simple alternatives, slavery or freedom. New section, Critiques of Wittfogel. Wittfogel's Oriental Despotism provoked a strong response, both positive and negative, from diverse sources. We'll concentrate here on the criticisms. Levin focused on Wittfogel's early view in the relation to nature. I don't know who Levin is. This is from I don't know if this, excuse me. One second, I want to see if I can find out who this Levin person is. Come on. Lewin. Maybe it's Moshe Lewin. It's G. Lewin. Gunter Lewin. Okay. Yeah, I'm not saying anything for Gunter Leuven. Sorry for wasting your time. Leuven focused on, it might be Levin, but there's two spellings. It says the first one's Levin, and the next one's Lewin. So I think it's a typo. So Levin focused on Wittfogel's, Levin focused on Wittfogel's early critique of the relation to nature. We'll begin with his critique. Marx and Engels, Levin argued, thought that the geographical conditions only influenced the features of social development and did not determine them, as Wittfogel had argued in 1932. Quote, necessity and outward usefulness determine the character of cooperative labor. From the need grow the activity and the will to evolve over new productive forces. Quote, outward utility, end quote, the particular characteristic of the natural surroundings present. The quote, outward utility, end quote, the particular characteristic of the natural surroundings present. Levin's emphasis decides the outcome of this activity, ... Cooperative activity always moves continuously in a specific direction, but this specific direction results from the objective, or in the last analysis, the natural basis, ... Levin in Bailey and Yubera. Levin called this perspective absurd. Whether or not the properties of natural materials were realized and contributed to development depended on the cooperative activity of humans. The manner in which humans acted on nature, whose chemical and physical properties remained the same throughout history, was determined by the development of the productive forces, the relations of production and their interrelation. The influence of natural conditions was great at the primitive stage of development, but even here the same natural conditions did not lead to similar forms of social organization. Wittfogel, by comparison, argued that the natural environment controls the nature of the human community living in it, a determination which persisted, determining the fate of people throughout their existence, and continuing to determine capitalist and even socialist society. In addition, Wittfogel's argument on the relation between industrial revolution and different resource environments could not explain the industrial development of resource-poor Japan, nor the lack of such development in resource-rich China. Wittfogel also neglected spatial differences in the level of the development of social control over nature. While Marx emphasized the effect of human labor on nature, Wittfogel made labor entirely dependent on the originally existing natural resources. As Wittfogel clung to the idea that natural conditions determine the production system, irrigation works, and the necessary intervention of the despotic government, factors alien to Marxist theory, he never developed a class analysis or a theory of societal evolution. Quote, this inevitably takes Wittfogel into the antithesis of Marxism, end quote. Levin in Bailey and Yubera. It looks like there's I don't know if it's the same book, but almost the book being referenced is The Asiatic Mode of Production, Science and Politics, which is an edited volume from 1981 by an Anne M. Bailey and a Joseph R. Yubera. The abstract says, this wide-ranging collection of articles, first published in 1981, documents the development of the intellectual and political aspects of the concept of the Asiatic mode of production, a concept central to the Western understanding of non-capitalist societies. Back to the text. I.A. Levada in Sovetskaya, or Sovetskaye, Sovetskae, space Kitevednie, 1958, emphasized Wittfogel's anti-Soviet political position. Marx's original position on the Asiatic mode had been that the, quote, natural economy of small communities was the foundation of the social structure in the countries of the East, end quote. The state was sole proprietor of land. General slavery was characteristic. Discussions in Soviet science, analyses of Eastern societies conducted, quote, in the light of Marx's remarks, end quote, had shown that they did not substantiate the existence of a special Asiatic social formation. One should speak only of slaveholding or feudal societies in the East. Wittfogel, Levada argued, tried to infer the form of the state from the peculiarities of the geographical environment. But in Oriental despotism, he went further, adding the free will of a people who have a genuine choice to the list of causal conditions. For Wittfogel, people always valued the concept of the individual with rights, one who weighed the historical consequences of his activities. But as Marx argued, the concept of individual rights had a historical character, i.e., it could only appear when development had broken the primitive unity of man and community. Furthermore, the idea that primitive tribes were able to evaluate the social consequences of irrigation, Levada called absurd. This method of, quote, historical voluntarism, end quote, led to a subjective interpretation of history. The peoples of the Orient, quote, chose, end quote, despotism. Those of the West were primordially free. For Wittfogel, the superstructure was the determining force, in which the state was allocated the determining role, the property being reduced to a legal form derived from the state. Wittfogel does not see in ownership an objective economic relation, a historical social form of appropriation, and therefore reached the conclusion that property played an unimportant role in the East. The foundation of the state did not lie in a certain form of property, therefore, but in a form of management of the economy. The men of the managerial apparatus were then said to form a ruling class. Wittfogel spoke of ruling rather than exploiting class, for there were no economic classes in the hydraulic society, only groups appearing thanks to the state. Marxism, however, stressed people in systems of economic relations. It did not see the bureaucracy as a special class, but as a stratum administering in the interests of the economically exploiting classes. The bureaucracy remained in this position only as long as class antagonistic society existed. Quote, in socialism, the functions of administration are not a monopoly of any special group, but a matter of all the working masses. Consequently, a, quote, bureaucratic class, end quote, never existed in the past and does not exist now, end quote. Levada. This is just a thought, but this seems like an instance of the way that dogmatic Marxists tend to anachronistically impute the division between the economy and the state to other societies that are not capitalist. I can't really put the thought together right here, and I don't know if I have a fully formed thought on the subject, but it seems like this becomes a very big problem when you're talking about Soviet-type societies, right? Because that was like one of the main defenses of that Trotsky. I think one of the main defenses Trotsky puts forward, at least for his defense of the degenerated worker state thesis, is that the bureaucracy could not constitute itself as a class, because a bureaucracy can only, even if it acts in a self-serving way, can only fundamentally oversee economic relations that it is not fundamentally in control of in some capacity. So even if it affords itself privileges and stuff and becomes very large and powerful and has a relative autonomy in society, it could not be said to be a class. And I think this is like one of the like big problems that the whole idea that the bureaucracies cannot constitute themselves as classes and are only kind of like perhaps self-serving and very powerful mediators between economic forces that are external to it to a large extent, causes major problems when trying to formulate a theory of Soviet-type societies. And this is what the bureaucratic collectivists and the state capitalist theories of the USSR are going to take Trotsky to task for, basically saying that the bureaucracy constitutes itself, in the case of the bureaucratic collectivist, as a class steeped in a bureaucratically planned, nationalized economy, and the state capitalists are going to say that the bureaucracy exists in the USSR as a capitalist class. And not that there's either of those theories are perfect, or that they don't miss things or something like that. But I think the idea that the bureaucracy, especially in a case where private property is not a major factor in the economic life of the society, and the formal or informal ownership of the major means of production is in the hands of the state. I don't think you can say that. I don't think you can say that those who operate that bureaucracy, it's impossible for the people who operate the bureaucracy to exist as a class. Anyway, that's a bunch of mumbo jumbo for me, but just thinking to myself. Wittfogel was equally wrong in asserting that Oriental land ownership differed completely from European feudalism as a result of its bureaucratic character, and the concept of the extra economic classes of hydraulic society contradicted the real history of class struggle over economic interest in the East. Having eradicated class struggle as the moving force, Wittfogel found it in the state. The ruler of this state was not societal or naturally limited in his actions, hence the voluntarism of Wittfogel's method. Quote, he does not try to recognize inevitable and lawful social relations behind the, quote, arbitrary, end quote, activity of individuals, the sovereigns, ... end quote. For in fact, no despot could destroy the classes on which he depended. Thus, instead of explaining the real conditions and role of the despotic state in the East as, quote, a form of political development inevitable at a certain stage, which is one of the urgent tasks of science, he concerns himself with the sentimental, quote, exposure, end quote, of the horrors of despotism, end quote. Levada and Bailey and Yubera, that's from the same volume that I referenced earlier, that Levin was in. A false concept of the managerial state is then used against the socialist system. The socialist state differs fundamentally from earlier states which were exploitative and not simply managerial. The management of the publicly owned economy is directed towards serving the interests of the whole society. A centralized economy gives birth to centralized coercion only when imposed on a petty dispersed economy as in China and Egypt, where large-scale cooperation depended on coercion and the actions of the despotic state. In socialism, by comparison, cooperation becomes a conscious and free form of social relations. Wittfogel constructs a false schema of hydraulic society and a multilinear theory of history in order to reject the idea of the inevitability of the transition to communism. Wittfogel believes the East to be incapable of independent development. Only with the help of the capitalist West can it be liberated from hydraulic despotism. However, in reality, while capitalism did play a positive role in undermining the foundations of natural economy, imperial domination has long been a brake on economic development in dependent countries. Quote, escape from the imperialist yoke is essential for the East, end quote. A state economy provides a way of achieving independent development. That quote is from Levada. The Soviet Union and China confirmed that a true emancipation of the individual is possible only on the basis of a progressing socialist economy. Arnold Toynbee also found Wittfogel's apolitical book, Stalking the Russian Communists, beneath its load of authentic learning. Toynbee is one of the most famous historians ever, right? Arnold J. Toynbee, who lived from 1889 to 1975, was an English historian, a philosopher of history, and author of numerous books, and research professor of international history at the London School of Economics and King's College London. From 1918 to 1950, Toynbee was considered a leading specialist on international affairs. From 1929 to 1956, he was the director of studies at Chatham House, in which position he also produced 34 volumes of the Survey of International Affairs, a quote, Bible, end quote, for international specialists in Britain. Toynbee is best known for his 12-volume Study of History, 1934 to 1961, or that's when the books were coming out, with his prodigious output of papers, articles, speeches, and presentations, and numerous books translated into many languages. Toynbee was a widely read and discussed scholar in the 1940s and 1950s. So, back to the text. Arnold Toynbee also found Wittfogel's A Political Book, Stalking the Russian Communists, beneath its load of authentic learning. Toynbee would have preferred a frontal attack to one via the roundabout route of agro-managerial despotism. Wittfogel did humankind a disservice in trying to resuscitate the propaganda myth invented by the Greeks of an antithesis between a good Europe and a bad Asia. He flew in the face of the considered opinion of his colleagues in trying to apply, quote, the Marxian thesis that the means of production rigidly determine all other elements of social life, end quote, to the, quote, magically vicious soil of Asia, end quote. Toynbee, in the Asiatic Mode of Production volume I mentioned earlier by Bailey and Yobera. The idea that large-scale artificial water control produced a uniform type of agro-managerial despotism was contradicted in Lombardy and the Netherlands. The difference between Asiatic irrigation societies are greater than their similarities. And Wittfogel is, quote, barking up the wrong tree, end quote, for even a cursory comparative study of total power finds it more frequently in rainfall agricultural societies, such as National Socialist Germany and Russia, where Wittfogel's idea of a Tartar connection with China is a, quote, very far-fetched piece of speculation, end quote. Toynbee. There is nothing more to Wittfogel's thesis than the, quote, obvious truth that large-scale enterprises cannot be carried out without a unified and effective high command, end quote. In his reply to Toynbee, there have been two direct replies to the left critiques. Wittfogel claimed that Toynbee confuses authoritarian leadership with total power. Worse, Toynbee mistook Wittfogel's actual statements on, quote, the dependence of the economic on the ecological factor and the dependence of the latter on cultural conditions which in open historical situations offer a variety of choices, end quote. For Marxian economic determinism, indeed, other reviewers commented that he had refuted Marxian economic determinism. Far from depicting Oriental despotism as uniform, he gave much attention to its multiformity. He presented in his book substantial confirmed evidence of Asiatic influences on Russia, a menace he might be, but only to the worst form of total power. There's some fighting in the neighborhood. A large amount of work was subsequently inspired, at least in part, by Wittfogel's ideas. Wittfogel's biographer Ullman lists some of the research supporting the theory of hydraulic society, work on the agrarian question in Egypt, the early formation of Vietnamese social institutions, property, revenue, and government structures in Tibet, Africa's monarchical absolutisms, and hydraulic tribes, research on China, Ceylon's land tenure and kinship systems, Melanesia, irrigation villages in Tanganyika, and work on Benin. Let's see if anything comes up for... let's see if G.L. Ullman. Oh no. A large amount of work was subsequently inspired, at least in part, by Wittfogel's ideas. Wittfogel's biographer, Ullman, lists some of this research supporting the theory. Oh, sorry, no, I'm spacing out because I can't pay attention because there's people fucking screaming at each other in front of my house. For a, quote, balanced assessment, end quote, of Wittfogel's influence on anthropological research, we can look at J.H. Stewart's 1977 summary of Wittfogel's hydraulic thesis and its results. Julian Haynes Stewart was an American anthropologist known best for his role in developing the concept and method of cultural ecology as well as the scientific theory of cultural change. Back to the text. Wittfogel's hypothesis is understood by Stewart as outlined as follows, quote, he developed the hypothesis that the early civilized states of both the eastern and western hemispheres were integrated by the managerial controls required to construct and maintain the irrigation and more broadly hydraulic systems. As water was brought to arid lands, food production and population increased and became the basis for class-structured states and the achievement of civilization. While historians of culture were emphasizing differences between civilizations, Wittfogel was postulating a single basic factor that brought all of the civilizations into being, end quote. Stewart in Bailey and Yubara, the Asiatic Mode of Production book I was referencing earlier. The 30 years since Wittfogel's first important publications has produced research which throws doubt on the universal applicability of the irrigation hypothesis, Stewart said. In many instances, the importance of irrigation was overemphasized, while in others its development results from, rather than causes, the growth of states. It is clear that managerial control of irrigation and hydraulic works was not everywhere the principal factor underlying the growth of early civilizations. A strong religious factor was evident, hence state integration around theocratic controls, while other forms of control and later militaristic authority were also important. But it was also certain that irrigation increased food productivity and required coordination and cooperative activity, making necessary some form of managerial control. Quote, in short, end quote, Stewart concluded, quote, instead of, quote, throwing out the baby with the irrigation water, end quote, the need is to recognize the particular combinations of factors, including the kind of irrigation, which operated in each case. Wittfogel's hypothesis challenges the disbelievers to produce alternative explanations, which are more than accounts of the uniqueness of individual cases, end quote. New section. This is a surprising title of the section. Critique of Revolutionary Anarchism. I wasn't surprised. I was expecting to see that as a title. Since the late 1960s, Wittfogel has been writing a book on Marxism and anarchism, a treatise on the morality of revolution. A brief summary of these more recent political ideas provides a fighting conclusion to the survey. Wittfogel considers the anarchist philosopher William Godwin to have understood the crucial institutional differences between West and East. William Godwin, if you don't know, lived from 1756 to 1836, was an English journalist, political philosopher, and novelist. William Godwin is considered one of the first exponents of utilitarianism and the first modern proponent of anarchism. Godwin is most famous for two books that he published within the space of a year: An Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, An Attack on Political Institution, and Things as They Are, The Adventures of Caleb Williams, an early mystery novel which attacks aristocratic privilege. Based on the success of both, Godwin featured prominently in radical circles of London in the 1790s. William Godwin wrote prolifically in the genres of novels, history, and demography throughout his life. In the conservative reaction to British radicalism, Godwin was attacked in part because of his marriage to the feminist writer Mary Wollstonecraft, his marriage to the feminist writer Mary Wollstonecraft in 1797, and his candid biography of her after her death from childbirth. Their daughter, later known as Mary Shelley, would go on to write Frankenstein and marry the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. With his second wife, Mary Jane Clairmont, Godwin set up the juvenile library, allowing the family to write their own works for children, sometimes using nom de plumes, and translate and publish many other books, some of enduring significance. Godwin has had considerable influence on British literature and literary culture. So, that's William Godwin. Godwin finally rejected the validity of revolutionary anarchism for the West, where it threatened to destroy centuries of progress, but upheld its relevance for the East, where it would play a progressive role in the equitable form of government by destroying despotism. Wittfogel calls Godwin's a reformist anarchism, dedicated to methods like civil disobedience and nonviolent change. This is counterposed to revolutionary anarchism, a strategy for total destruction initiated by Bakunin, modified by Kropotkin, and resurrected in the 1960s by a revolutionary New Left. In studying the history of this movement, Wittfogel finds it, quote, necessary to place Bakunin and Kropotkin's development within the framework of a conflict-ridden Russian society in which conflict-sensitive young men could easily envisage an increasingly dissatisfied peasantry as the potential storm center in a growing societal crisis, end quote. Bakunin, Wittfogel argues, placed his trust in the profound common sense of the peasantry, distrusting abstract and bookish sciences. Wittfogel correlates this with the rejection of science by the New Left. A concept of revolution based on Russian conditions was applied by the New Left in the 1960s to conditions found in the West. Revolutionary forces are bent on the total destruction of society, its institutions, value system, and spirit. Wittfogel pleads for a realistic understanding of Western institutions and a revitalization of a value system which more than any other has assured freedom of thought and action. Wittfogel believes in, quote, democracy with teeth, end quote. New section. Summary and assessment. Wittfogel was born in an intellectual milieu saturated with Marxist political ideas, which interacted with his personal interest in rural geography and society derived from his family background. A fascination with the natural factor in history was the logical outcome of this interaction. Wittfogel's ideas were remarkably similar to those of Plekhanov, who, in answering the question which determines the development of the productive forces at the disposal of society, he proposed, quote, in this, its final form, it is sought first and foremost, by reference to the nature of the geographic environment, bracket, whose properties, end bracket, determine the character both of the natural products that serve to satisfy man's wants and those of object he himself produces. He himself produces with the same purpose, end quote. Wittfogel's formulation, however, was more complex. In terms of the relation between environment and production, more complete. In terms of its extension into the political superstructure, and more empirically exemplified in terms of his massive knowledge of Asiatic society. In Wittfogel's Marxian period, quote, mode of production, end quote, was interpreted as based on the unity of the natural and social forces of production. For Wittfogel, the direction taken by the labor process depended not on arbitrary human choices, but in the environment of natural means of production effective in any historical moment. In particular, the natural factor played a determining role in the formation of the Asiatic mode of production. Specifically, in China, the physical environment necessitated wide social cooperation in large-scale hydraulic works, which in turn were the basis for the bureaucratic state and other institutional forms, such as the strongly patriarchal family. The overwhelming powerful political superstructure then reacted on the economic base, restricting the development of new forces of production under the control of potentially antagonistic classes. Hence the, quote, lateral, end quote, form of development and lack of growth of capitalism in the East. During the later 1930s and in the 1940s, Wittfogel's conception of society changed along with his political inclinations. Wittfogel sees this as a progression in which much of the essential structure of his ideas remained intact. We think differently. Wittfogel had a long dispute with the Soviets on theoretical grounds, the Asiatic mode of production, and related political issues, centralization of power in the Soviet Union. Wittfogel had a series of profound personal experiences in the 1930s, especially his imprisonment by the Nazi SA and SS. Then there was the McCarthy period of time when many of social democratic turned into anti-socialist, quote, freedom fighter, end quote. Yet Wittfogel had been a dedicated communist immersed in Marxian culture, contemptuous of those who did not profoundly appreciate Marx's ideas. Thus, for this reviewer, Wittfogel's dramatic shift in point of view remains enigmatic. Yet it was a transformation, even though certain elements of his earlier ideas are indeed transposed into the present. In Oriental Despotism, we find the natural environment suggesting hydraulic society as one possible human response in a historically open situation. Compare this possibilism with his earlier natural deterministic stance. We find in the later Wittfogel an inordinate stress on the despotic character of the bureaucratic state as a basis for an all-out attack on totalitarian regimes of a, quote, socialist but not a fascist type. And finally, much of Wittfogel's later work is a polemic against Marx, to whom he had previously dedicated his finest thoughts. This is profound evidence of a transformation in philosophy, methodology, purpose, and in such a dedicated political man, personality. Even so, Wittfogel's ideas, even in this later period, are hardly devoid of insights useful even to the Marxists he attacks. Wittfogel's analysis of the spatial order of the Asiatic mode of production builds on his earlier interest in the dialectics of space. His idea of different densities of hydraulic institutions, distinguishing the core margin and submargin of the Asiatic mode of production, points the way toward a sophisticated materialist analysis of space in pre-capitalist and capitalist societies. Correspondence between geographic shifts in core regions and phases of the historical development of a given society, and the relations between internal and external sources of change are similarly pregnant with possibilities for a more profound radical geographic analysis. Some of his anti-Soviet polemics, like his explanation for the embarrassing equivocation on the issue of the Asiatic mode, reverberate with the ring of truth. Wittfogel has frequently been dismissed as a renegade. Instead, Wittfogel deserves attention as a great geographical thinker. The end. And the end note says, Wittfogel remains director of the Chinese History Project and lives in New York City. 1986 will mark his 90th birthday. Thanks for listening. I appreciate it.